I'm here at the Gaylord Convention Centre and Hotel at a conference, and I've hooked up with Dave Feldman, who's also here. So we're going to have a quick chat on some very interesting topics. So great to meet you again, Dave.
Likewise, Ivor. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And there was recently a podcast with yourself and Peter Attia, which seems to have generated a certain modicum of controversy and differing opinions. And in fact, it springs to mind, I caught a little of it, but it springs to mind that there was a kind of a sequence put ahead of the podcast to argue against your views. That was interesting.
Yeah, so, okay. So certainly we're jumping right into it. First, I want to thank Peter Attia for having me on. I was appreciating the opportunity. And for that matter, I want to welcome any good opportunities for being able to further advance this conversation on the lipid energy model. Yes, so certainly there have been some interesting questions that have been brought up from that, and I actually kind of wanted to address it, but in really the most intellectually honest way I feel like I can. I want to represent all views of everybody involved as effectively as possible. So what I did, in order to be sure that I didn't misquote too much, is I've actually made sure that I've written things down on my iPad, which I have in view here. And I want to actually get to the first point. What Peter said to open it up is he said Dave was unable to explain the mass balance. And since then, by the way, mass balance has been shot around quite a bit on Twitter, meaning how does one account for the greater amount of cholesterol in and the greater number of LDL particles? No one, including Dave, is disputing that the phenotype of interest has more LDL-C and more LDL-P. And he's speaking of lean mass hyperresponders, for that matter, just hyperresponders in general. And that's absolutely true. But he says there are only three ways this can happen. Make more, clear less, transfer from other pools that we can't see. And that's actually going to be my first contention. No, there actually is a fourth. The fourth, and this is one I've repeated several points throughout the podcast, is recirculate existing. So let's kind of break that down for a second. Let's say that you, Ivor, you go on a ketogenic diet and you just taken your cholesterol test and you had an LDL of 100. And the following week you have an LDL of 200. Now, per what Peter's talking about, I would expect that probably you absorbed more or you synthesized more. It came from another pool. But what then happens when we see that your increased LDL of 200 a week later is still in an LDL of 200? Did that mean that you actually further synthesized more, further absorbed more, or is it at all possible that you recirculated more? What would be your answer?
I would say that recirculation, if the physiology has decided that 200 is the appropriate level through whatever means, initially it may be generated or taken from a pool, but then in steady state you'd pretty much be recirculating unless you were using a lot of that cholesterol elsewhere and you have to therefore top up, probably recirculating.
Well, and this is the point, is to what degree we recirculate, that's something that really nobody can answer. But what's being talked about here is he's talking about why it is that we would see in this phenotype an increased amount of cholesterol in a blood test. From a blood test, I would argue you can't easily tell from whether these are from pools or for whether it's been synthesized, say, the day of, or whether it's been recirculated from the day before, or for that matter, the week before, right?
Yeah, without exotic tracers, you couldn't say that.
Not from exactly. Not with, I should say, from a more exotic blood test.
Yeah.
Right, which actually, came forth on an experiment or something along those lines. And this is why I think there was a little bit of confusion, because I agree with the following statement. Most of the cholesterol in our body is endogenous, meaning we made it, and then we recirculate it. Maybe about 15% is exogenous, maybe less. It would depend on a number of other factors. That quote is actually Peter Attia in the same podcast. And to actually go further, I kind of repeated this several times as this kept bringing up. He says, a little bit later, he says, but my point is, unless you've depleted a pool of cholesterol elsewhere in his body, and he's speaking of Craig Moffat, who's a hyperresponder, just on mass balance, you had to make more of it. And I responded, well, as far as I understand, the liver can recycle cholesterol as many times as it wants to. And in follow-up, he agreed. He said, again, that's true. And the liver and the gut have a very clear pathway, which was described, right?
Yeah.
And this is, I think this is why I was kind of thrown off toward the end of the podcast, is we had talked about recirculation at several points throughout, but then toward the end, he said yes. But if you go through the kinetics of this, I can't follow why he should still have that much LDL cholesterol unless he is making more cholesterol. Again, he's speaking of Craig Moffat. In other words, I've tried to think of this 10 ways to Sunday. The only way on a mass balance that I can explain this hypothesis is he's making more cholesterol. And that's where it led me into asking him straight up, I mean, do you feel like he's literally making 3 times more cholesterol each day? And I certainly don't share that opinion, but I mean, we'll get Craig Moffat to actually test this. I don't think that when we actually see these precursors that we're going to actually see a tripling of the total production of cholesterol.
Right. And again, the way I viewed it, and I have yet to look at the full podcast, but I skimmed through it the night I came back from Santa Cruz. I was kind of jet lagged. But the way
it's so short, though.
yeah, well, there you are. But what struck me was that, yes, you will have a transient early on in this shift to this phenotype. You will create or absorb cholesterol from more pools to enable the 300 figure and the higher particle number. You are making more lipoproteins, and they need their nominal ratio of triglyceride to cholesterol, so you'll need to feed the cholesterol into that process early on, which is unsteady state. But like you say, once you're in this semi-steady state of 300, you're simply recycling components to maintain that. Now, a bigger question is, why does the body want to maintain the higher level of 300? But that's a separate question. Mass balance questions don't get in the way of any of this, I feel.
Well, and again, I mean, if it was a fixed system, I could believe that, right? Like, let's say that the rate of absorption was fixed. Let's say that the supply of cholesterol coming from your adipocytes was fixed. Let's say that the outbound cholesterol going into the bile, let's say all of that was fixed. Then I absolutely believe a case could be made on mass balance from a blood test. Because it would be like race cars entering a track, but the total amount of time they could be on that track was fixed. Well, then absolutely. Then at that point you could say, well, now we can actually determine from a snapshot up above exactly how much of a difference it could make.
Yes, but that is not the case. There are movements in all those vectors, and he's maintaining an average of 300, which with all the inputs and outputs can relatively easily be maintained should the physiology desire to maintain that, which it appears to do.
And I mean, again, this is the point at which I'm saying it's not so much that I am making a case for exactly what amount has been recirculated and hasn't. Do I think that there's been a lot more that gets recirculated with lean mass hyperresponders? I do. But to what proportion, I don't know. And if you do listen to the podcast, if you get a chance, listen to it a little bit later in. I'm actually at several points when I feel like this is a place where we're kind of getting stuck. I try to unpack it a little bit more. But I think that there was just a lot of excitement, I guess, and there wasn't really as much of a chance toward the end to kind of like really kind of speak on it. I think Peter was very excited to kind of discuss his ideas on that, and that's why I wasn't able to finish a lot of these thoughts. You'll know what I mean when you listen to it.
Right, okay. Before the moment, the jury is out on this particular aspect of the prebuttal. It would appear that, there is ample room for your theory with respect to this question to still be sound. It is certainly not in any way disproven through the mass balance discussion, I think.
Honestly, I feel like I've already talked too much about the mass balance question relative to what it is.
Right.
His second point I find a little more interesting, and I really want to delve into this. So I'm going to quote him directly here. Second point, Dave argues that VLDL production is driving LDL concentration. But the fact remains that insulin-sensitive people, which presumably lean mass hyperresponders are, and I agree with everything he's saying up to this point, the opposite is true. There are fewer, not more, triglycerides being exported from the liver. Now, I'm actually pausing mid-sentence. He says more, but I want to pause on that real quick. So again, this is making a judgment based on a blood test. That if you, Ivor, took a fasted blood test after 12 hours in the morning, that we could tell how much triglycerides are being exported from your liver in VLDLs by what the triglycerides show up on in your bloodstream from a blood test.
Right, but that's not possible without tracers and a time-based experiment to find out if that is the case.
Well, it would be possible if that was a fixed rate of turnover.
But it's not.
Well, and that's obviously the position that I take, right? Is what's fascinating about this statement is that it was actually Thomas Dayspring had actually additional notes in the transcript and further chimed in with the same statement. This is directly from his note. He says, "But since fat is trafficked in triglycerides, why does triglycerides drop in such persons?" And he's speaking of lean mass hyperresponders. So again, to recap, I'm stating, yes, I think that if you're powered more by fat, then more VLDLs are being secreted. If it's more VLDLs are being secreted, you actually are you're more of them are being depleted on a per particle basis at a faster rate. Definitely in comparison to somebody who's insulin resistant, right?
Yeah.
Definitely compared to somebody who's like type 2 diabetic. Let me give you just a simple analogy. If we put out a bunch of food trucks during the lunch rush, we wouldn't be surprised if they came back empty in 2 hours. If we put out a bunch of food trucks at 3 a.m. in the morning, they're not gonna have a lot of customers, right? So without question, yes, I'm absolutely making the case that there's something different with the VLDL triglyceride turnover. And I certainly think if you're powered by fat, that makes a difference. Now, for what it's worth, I think that this is probably the most key difference that does need to get zeroed in on is I'm definitely, certainly my energy model is very much reliant on us ultimately determining for sure with that phenotype, with lean mass hyperresponders, that they are in fact showing a higher secretion of VLDLs, because that would in fact explain why there would be a higher number of LDL particles and therefore higher LDL cholesterol. So at the point where we can actually test that directly with that phenotype, not just with the general population, then that'll answer that question. I'm very excited to find that out.
Yeah, me too. And I guess so for an average person, fatty acids coming with albumin from the adipose tissue, the adipocytes, might give the lion's share of the flux and not so much VLDL. But we are talking specifically about this phenotype, which may very well be different and may disproportionately be using VLDL to transport these triglycerides.
Yeah, well, and I want to actually acknowledge you and Gabor, who brought to my attention a while ago about the personal fat threshold. So let's get into that for a sec, because in a way you could almost say it's a lack of parking in your adipocytes, which I think mechanistically explain why it is that there would be a slower turnover of triglycerides and VLDLs. So you have less and less affinity out there for the existing adipocytes on not only the turnover of triglycerides for them, but also the turnover of triglycerides in the VLDLs in the first place, which could explain why it's true you can see a lot of VLDLs, you can see a lot of triglycerides in people who have type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, and they have major, and we have some fantastic studies, for whether sourced from Gabor or myself, where we see healthy lean people versus overweight, slightly insulin resistant people. We see when they eat meals, the slightly insulin resistant, heavier people, the fat from the meal that's nuclear trace doesn't get taken up in the adipocytes, and it basically is left floating around and goes back to the liver, where they create more VLDL, more ApoB. So that's the kind of fatter person. But the slim person, the fat from their meals rockets into their adipocytes and nicely flows out later when they're fasting.
Yes,
which makes absolute sense. I called it the VLDL ApoB merry-go-round, that people who are insulin resistant are not taking up in the adipose the fat from their meals, and are hence sending the fat to the liver, creating more VLDL, which doesn't have a whole lot of places to go, and creating this whole phenotype of unhealthy living.
That's right. Well, and this is where I want to unpause the original second statement of what Peter says, in that he then goes on to say, and there is less, not more, ApoC3 on VLDL, thereby reducing, not increasing, their residence time. I fully agree with that. But here's the catch. The catch is, as I was saying before, I think this is a dynamic system, which Peter agreed with on the ApoC3, and in particular with insulin. He says earlier in the podcast, yeah, I mean, you should have a low level of C3 because your insulin levels are quite low. He's talking about me. Talking about, of course, yeah, the C3 is following the insulin. It's not a fixed rate of C3 distribution. And actually, this also got brought up with Dayspring in one of the notes. As I said, a little bit later in the podcast, I said, I have obviously done enormous amounts of self-testing to do this. And that's exactly one of the things I want to check is how dynamic or not dynamic the distribution of things like ApoC3 are based on, for example, existing illness or energy distribution and so forth. And Thomas Dayspring commented in, theoretically, but ApoC3 is transferable, which is absolutely true. And it's yet a further dynamism of the system itself. So it's not just that it could follow insulin resistance, it's that it's also is exchangeable between different lipoproteins, especially HDL. So I want to get to the third point because I really find the third point especially interesting. Peter then goes on to say, even if you ignore the above points, which you can't, I am more unconvinced than ever at the notion that we should exclude the roughly, and it's important you listen to this carefully, roughly 2,000 genetic mutations known to produce a phenotype of high LDL-C, high HDL-C, and low triglycerides. He's talking about the triad that I'm focusing on. Now again, I want to be as intellectually honest as possible. I think actually Peter made an honest misstatement here because during the podcast when he talks about the 2,000 phenotypes, he was speaking to familial hypercholesterolemia and in the context of just LDL-C.
Absolutely. So I immediately caught that and assumed the same thing had to be the case because those thousands refer to high LDL, but I'm not aware that any have been looking at high LDL, high HDL, and low trig together. Combos.
No, believe me, if there was one,
we'd be all over it.
I would absolutely want to know. And for that matter, I've suggested this before to other researchers who have said, you know what, just for fun, why not stratify on SNPs that affect these in these manners that we know are of these types, right? But there's no way that I believe there are 2,000. I don't even know if there's 10. I have no idea. But I'm doubtful of phenotypes that would result in that triad, that it would be there.
Now, there is a further complication that the SNPs with high LDL that tend towards suggesting higher CVD, when they've looked at SNPs with HDL being higher, there's not so much of an apparent causal driver. So someone could claim, well, why bother looking at the HDL? It's been looked at in isolation, and it doesn't seem to link up causally. So, but this is getting more into the weeds and the detail.
It is, but it's important when we're talking about genetic studies because Peter certainly feels very strongly about the importance of using the existing Mendelian randomizations because he feels it's the strongest evidence. And this is what's fascinating is let's say that I modify this to what I believe he means. I believe that he meant there are 2,000 phenotypes that change LDL cholesterol. And maybe he was including both LDL cholesterol and LDL particle count. I don't know. But of the roughly 2,000, and actually I've been trying to since then search and find where this is like listed somewhere because I've been keeping my own list of SNPs that adjust LDL-C. And granted, it's getting fairly large. I think it's at around 200. But I don't actually know where I can go and find that. Maybe it's something where it's like a search result in one of the databases or something along those lines. But if anybody knows that, please send that my way. I'd be very interested. But here's the thing. Let's say that he's right. So getting back to these 2,000 SNPs, my concern is this actually might make the case for Mendelian randomizations worse, not better. Because it means it's only a teeny tiny fraction of those that are being selected to make for a comparison on poor outcomes.
So selection bias could be a concern there, depending on the author's knowledge or how much they want a good result.
It could be. And let me reinforce that I don't disregard genetic studies as a whole. My biggest concern, as I've illustrated quite a bit in the podcast, was that I would prefer if we use SNPs that don't impact the health of the cell. So you yourself, you've actually just talked about this recently. I actually saw this on one of your lectures, is that unfortunately, if you have something that impacts the lipid metabolism of the cell, then it doesn't function properly compared to another cell that might not have that SNP present in the body, right? In the sense that why would we want to compare cells that have any disruption or dysfunction of uptake of either lipids or lipoproteins if that same cell in another body, particularly if it's an endothelial cell, if that's going to matter? And so that's why I would like to just do an SNP study where we say, grab people like those with glycogen storage disease who see a change in their lipids, but it has nothing to do with the health of the cells of their, the health of their endothelial cells.
Yeah, and I'd agree. And I mean, this is something that would just have to be resolved. Ideally, there would be an SNP that purely relates to higher numbers of particles without drawing in lower receptor reactivity or activity.
Which I brought up in the podcast, by the way. I really emphasized that point. I'm not sure if it just wasn't... I'm not sure if I could have communicated better, or...
I had a slight falling off the chair moment when, because I have been researching endothelium and glycocalyx and transcytosis and paracellular transport across the endothelial barrier of LDL particles in past months. And I have gone through the LDL receptor in the endothelial cells, and there's no question that it's there. It takes in lipoproteins, they go to lysosomes, the components are taken out, and the receptor returns to the cell surface. And what's more, I have a paper where if you bring up the concentration of LDL in the lumen by 10 times, the endocytosis rate doesn't change, which you'd expect because the cell is deciding at what rate it wants to endocytose. But I caught in the discussion with Peter that the endothelial cells, it was said, don't have receptors. Or
right, yeah. So let me unpack that a little bit. What happened was it actually was on the discussion of the SNPs, because I was saying I would like to exclude those SNPs that would impact LDL receptors, such as those that have familial hypercholesterolemia, because why would I want an endothelial cell that could it could impact their health? And again, to kind of set this up, when I was going in, I figured that Peter and I would disagree on a lot of the top level, interpretation of the data. I didn't think that we would disagree on any of the fundamentals. So in a way, I kind of went in prepared to just sort of concede if he corrected me at any point on any of the fundamentals. I would just say, okay, well then you're probably right. Because to be sure, he wrote the Bible, if you will, that I kind of, started my journey on lipidology with the Straight Dope on Cholesterol, which, by the way, I think is a great series.
Yep.
So he stopped me very intensely at one point and said, no, hold on. What was that you just said? And I was talking about endothelial cell receptors. And he said there are, and I hope I'm paraphrasing this correctly, he says there are no endothelial cell receptors, or there are no LDL receptors on endothelial cells.
Yeah, seem to focus just on the liver.
Yeah, well, that was really kind of a surreal moment for me in a way, because I sort of stopped and I was kind of like, well, I'm mostly sure that I'm right on this one, but it's Attia. Attia knows quite a bit more than I, and by the way, I still concede he knows quite a bit more than I do on many of the fundamentals, for sure. And I really had a moment where I was kind of judging it myself. And then eventually I was like, you know what? It's not as central to the point of whether or not there's a compromise of the health of the cells anyway. So I kind of moved from there on to the adipose sites. But what can I say? So...
Yeah, it was very unusual, and I'm sure it'll get clarified. I think you've done a transcript with your answers to many of these questions and invited Peter to reply. So that's one specific, clear one that he will reply to, I guess. So we'll wait for that. But yeah, I've been through the endothelial and all that biochemistry in recent months, and we have receptors all over the place, and indeed receptors for transcytosis of LDL particles across the cell into the intima. And there's multiple receptors for that, and even non-receptor mediated transcytosis can occur. So much science out there. But of course, endothelial LDL receptor to bring in lipoprotein for components, inherently it's part of the endothelial cell, unless all the papers published that I've been reading are just all wrong.
And I'm gonna play devil's advocate and Peter's defense lawyer in a moment. I think that might have been what he was thinking of when he was talking about. I think he called it diffuse mediated, so that maybe there was some absorption that was diffuse mediated, but of course I don't think even knowing that you then can rule out endothelial cells having receptors. That was the thing. He just seemed very confident of it at the time, so I kind of went with that.
Yeah, you were right to roll with it and not call everything to a halt, and based on that point, it always gets resolved later. But I mean, there is paracellular transport between the endothelial tight junctions.
Right.
And there are macropores as well. And interestingly, the transcytosis of LDL particles across into the intima and the paracellular transport between the endothelial cells, there's a mountain of signs showing what actually drives that forward. And hey, guess what? It's all of the root causes that we always talk about, tumor necrosis factor alpha, hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, angiotensin 2. So what fascinates me is that, based on my recent research, this LDL getting across the endothelium into the intima and being part of the problem, which we kind of acknowledge, is mediated a lot by all of the really important root causes that we're concerned about. So it's interesting how the two bridge together.
Right. It really is fascinating stuff, and it's certainly something for which I want there to be more work, like you're talking about now, where we can determine how much of it is the root causes you're talking about versus just concentration total of LDL cholesterol. And it's why the energy model matters so much to me, and I think that might be why I'm so optimistic right now. I've honestly, this has probably been the best mood I've been in for maybe months, maybe years, honestly, because in a sense, I feel as if we've really moved the conversation forward. We've really helped to isolate where the differences are. Even if we concede that I may be right about the blood tests, it doesn't mean that Peter and Dayspring are wrong about the secretion. That's an important question to get answered. Maybe the most important question to get answered. Because if it's possible that there is a context that matters for why you would have high LDL cholesterol, for where it didn't have a deleterious outcome, it's something we should all know about, certainly.
Absolutely, and that is my key interest and has been for many years. And actually back in my original lecture on cholesterol in 13 or 14, I called out as in the top of the list of 5 risk factors, I had ApoB. Now, I certainly had ApoB over ApoA1 as a superior metric, but I had ApoB in there. And there's no doubt that higher counts can accelerate the problem of atherosclerosis. But it's under which conditions is crucial to me. And if we have a scenario A and maybe B and maybe another C where the high counts are not deleterious at all, really, we need to know those scenarios on behalf of public health. We need to know the scenarios where ApoB being higher is not really a problem. And we need to do people justice. And certainly we need to categorize when high ApoB is a problem. Like when it's driven by insulin resistance syndrome is an obvious case, but there may be many more. So yeah, I think this is an exciting time. For the first time, we're getting to categorize when ApoB is most problematic, when high, and when it may not be, and understand the mechanisms that underlie those different states.
And this is where I've got to really emphasize the biggest and most important thing I think that came from the podcast, which was that I was and still am pressing on the most key question. Now, certainly I would love it if I had a large data set that would show me not only LDL cholesterol, but LDL particle count in relation to a huge number of other metrics, including fasting insulin, including TNF alpha, many of the different metrics we talked about. But you know what? There is kind of a surrogate of sorts for things like insulin resistance, and that is HDL and triglycerides. And that's why I push then, because of not being able to have all of that additional data, I push on what I know does exist. I know we do have lipid numbers for LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. And I know they tend to be surrogates, but even for being surrogates, would we find that people with high LDL, high HDL, and low triglycerides are at high risk for cardiovascular disease? And as of today, fully 8 months, actually, I think this is the anniversary. I think this is the 8-month anniversary since I started the Low Carb Cholesterol Challenge. 2 months ago, this is the 2-month anniversary, since I put money behind it. I wanted to see if I could pay somebody to bring me any study that would show this. And I still haven't gotten anything for it.
Well, to speak to the safety of your money, and it's not a guarantee, I spent many years ago looking for that exact data, because in engineering you always seek for data to disprove your hypothesis.
Exactly.
So I went through a long process of trying to break my own hypotheses, which are essentially your one, by finding that data that high LDLP had an independence that would overrule HDL triglyceride ratio and insulin resistance. And I could not find the data. I could only find the opposite. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's incredible after 50 years of enormous investment in lipidology that we cannot just reach out now momentarily and pluck that data from a paper and discuss it.
And that's part of what I was bringing up a lot with Peter. As I said, look, let's look at MESA. Let's look at Women's Health Initiative. Let's look at Pure. I mean, let's get this data, let's look at it, let's find out if this phenotype, even if they're not originating as low carbers, that it perhaps could suggest a properly functioning lipid metabolism that is in fact at low risk. Because if this is the case, we need to know.
We absolutely do, and I think a recent paper by Volek and Finney is very similar to what you're doing. They have ultra athletes on high fat diets versus low fat. And these ultra-athletes are essentially seeing exactly what you're seeing.
Yes, and in fact, I hope you get to flash this up for the video.
Oh yeah, I'll put it in after.
Because I really want you to take a moment to think about this. Do you really think it was just purely a coincidence that they all happened to showcase exactly what we're talking about, this phenotype? So it turned out that they all happen to have inherent genes that led them to end up with higher levels of LDL cholesterol.
And particles.
And
the
particles,
whole suite.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is that really that coincidental, or is it possible that the way that they're powered makes the biggest difference of all?
And it switches on a phenotype that is inherently not unhealthy, even though it incorporates one risk factor, high particle count. But that is only, as Peter said himself, it's particle count, it's endothelial distress, and inflammatory forces. And that's what my recent talk was about, that the irony that even the endothelial health and the inflammatory problems that enable LDLP, as he said, it's necessary but not sufficient. But to enable it to be sufficient and to get the problem, it looks like the endothelial and the inflammatory vectors are all driven by the root causes that we primarily focus on. So it almost comes full circle.
It really does. And
it's fascinating.
And I all I can say is it's a blessing to live in such interesting times, because the thing I'm most fascinated by is that we're at a place where a lot of us are making this hypothesis in advance of the data, and I just can't wait to see how it turns out.
Yeah, and I would agree totally. I have my thoughts on where it will turn out. It may be a while before we get the data. But yes, I have my thoughts. And in the meantime, if people's LDLP shoots up, as we always say, and in our book, Eat Rich, Live Long, we have sections on ApoE for people and sections on just people where their LDLP shoots up when they change diet. And we lay out a change in dietary pattern to bring that back down again. It's kind of like what Peter said, a little less hardcore keto, more mono and more fish and avocado, and just to let people make their own call. But the scientific discussion, however, is for the likes of us, we got to find this answer independent of individuals' choices.
Definitely do. And I mean, I do want to emphasize just one more time. I did it several times on Peter's podcast. I'll do it here. I don't know the answer. Not yet. But I've never been so driven to try to find out for myself. But I can say this. I can honestly say more than ever before, I'm very cautiously optimistic. I think there's really a lot to be said for seeing what I believe is going to turn out to be a potentially healthy lipid profile and low inflammatory markers, that you may be in really good shape.
Yeah, and there are some ancestral peoples of diverse genetic heritage who have higher particle counts on average than the Americans, yet with no heart disease. So that's not proof, but it would certainly buttress your confidence, I would guess, in this matter. Right. So listen, we'll come back and we'll do another podcast, but I think this one covered the basics of the recent controversy.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, thank you for having me on, Ivor.
I know I have no hair, but I'm not Peter. Excellent, Dave. We'll catch up again soon.